Klaus Müller pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the train window, watching America roll past in endless waves of green and gold. 19 years old, hollow-cheeked and exhausted, he could barely comprehend what he was seeing. Fields stretched to the horizon, untouched by bombs or artillery. Farmhouses stood intact, their white paint gleaming in the June sunshine. Cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that had never known the thunder of tanks. Just 3 weeks ago, he had been crouched in a concrete bunker on the Normandy coast, listening to the naval bombardment that preceded the Allied invasion. The world had been nothing but noise and terror, the screams of dying men mixing with the whistle of incoming shells. He had fired his rifle until the barrel burned his hands, watching the beach fill with American soldiers who kept coming, wave after wave, unstoppable as the tide itself. When his commanding officer fell with half his head missing, Klaus had thrown down his weapon and raised his hands. He was done. The war was lost, had been lost for months, maybe years. Everyone knew it except the fanatics and the fools. He had chosen survival over ideology, and now he was here, crossing a country that seemed to exist in a different universe from the one he had left behind. The train car held 40 German prisoners, all captured in the first days after D-Day. They sat in silence mostly, too tired and too stunned for conversation. American guards stood at each end of the car, rifles ready but expressions bored. They chewed gum and smoked cigarettes, occasionally chatting with each other in relaxed tones that seemed impossible for soldiers. Where was the hatred? Where was the cruelty the propaganda had promised? Across from Klaus sat Hans Becker, a 32-year-old veteran whose eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much. He had survived Stalingrad, survived the retreat across Russia, survived the Eastern Front's frozen hell only to be captured in France. His uniform hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful. Now he was just another scarecrow in Wehrmacht gray. Next to Hans sat Friedrich Weber, 17 years old and still clinging to the tattered remains of his Hitler Youth indoctrination. His jaw was set in defiant lines, his blue eyes hard with the certainty of youth. He had volunteered for the Wehrmacht 6 months ago, eager to prove himself to the fatherland. The reality of war had not yet fully penetrated the armor of his ideology. Father Wilhelm Hartmann occupied the seat beside Klaus, his clerical collar long since discarded, but his bearing still carrying the quiet dignity of his former calling. At 45, he was old for a common soldier, but the Reich had been scraping the bottom of the barrel for manpower. He had been a Lutheran pastor in a small Bavarian village before being conscripted. Now he said little, but his eyes took in everything with a sadness that seemed to encompass the entire tragedy of their situation. The train slowed as it approached a small Kansas town. Klaus could see people on the streets going about their daily business. Women pushed baby carriages. Children played on sidewalks. A man washed his car in a driveway. It was so normal, so utterly untouched by war that it seemed like a dream. In Germany, cities were rubble. In France, every town bore the scars of occupation and liberation. But here, life continued as if the greatest conflict in human history was happening on another planet. Friedrich noticed Klaus staring and sneered. Decadent, soft. They have no idea what real struggle means. When the Führer unleashes the secret weapons, all this will burn. Hans turned his head slowly, fixing the boy with a look of such profound weariness that Friedrich actually flinched. There are no secret weapons, you stupid child. There is no miracle coming. We lost. Accept it, and maybe you will survive what comes next. Friedrich's face flushed red, but he said nothing. Even his fanaticism could not stand against the weight of Hans's experience. The older man had earned the right to speak truth, had paid for it in blood and frostbite and the screams of dying friends. Father Wilhelm spoke quietly, his voice barely audible over the train's rumble. We should prepare ourselves for whatever awaits us. The Americans will do what they will do. We can only maintain our dignity and our faith. Klaus nodded, though faith seemed like a luxury from another lifetime. He had prayed in the bunker as the shells fell. He had prayed when the Americans came over the top. He had prayed when they marched him to the beach as a prisoner, certain he would be shot. But God had not answered. Or perhaps the answer was simply that he was still alive when so many were not. Was that mercy or merely chance? The train journey had begun in England, where they had been processed through a massive prisoner collection point. British soldiers had searched them, documented them, assigned them numbers. Then came the Atlantic crossing on a Liberty ship, packed into holds that stank of vomit and unwashed bodies. Klaus had been certain the ship would be torpedoed by a U-boat, the final irony of being killed by his own side. But they had crossed safely, landing in New York Harbor where the Statue of Liberty had gazed down at them with what seemed like mockery. From New York, they had traveled by train across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and now into Kansas. Each mile took them further from everything they knew, deeper into the heart of enemy territory. Yet the enemy seemed strangely absent. The American guards were professional but not cruel. They received food twice a day, simple but adequate. No one had beaten them. No one had tortured them for information. It was all very confusing. Klaus remembered the propaganda films they had been shown during training. Americans were supposed to be mongrel barbarians, a mixed-race rabble without culture or discipline. They were supposed to torture prisoners, to violate the laws of war, to be everything the Reich was not. But the reality kept contradicting the narrative. The American soldiers seemed well-fed, well-equipped, and utterly confident. They had the casual competence of men who knew they were winning and saw no need to prove anything. The train began to slow further, and one of the guards called out, "All right, Krauts, end of the line. Welcome to Camp Concordia. You behave yourselves, you'll be treated fair. You cause trouble, you'll regret it. Simple as that." Klaus felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. This was it then. Whatever came next would determine whether he survived to see Germany again, to see his mother and sister, to walk the streets of his hometown. He had no idea if his family was even still alive. The last letter he had received was 4 months old, and it had been heavily censored. His mother had written carefully around the truth, but he could read between the lines. Food was scarce. The bombing was constant. People were afraid. The train lurched to a complete stop, and the guards began organizing the prisoners for disembarkation. Klaus grabbed his small bundle of possessions, everything he owned in the world now reduced to a spare shirt, a pair of socks, and a photograph of his family that had somehow survived the chaos of capture. He filed out with the others, blinking in the bright sunshine of a Kansas afternoon. The camp spread before them, a grid of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fences and guard towers. It looked efficient and organized, very American in its geometric precision. Prisoners already in residence watched from behind the wire as the new arrivals were marched through the gates. Klaus searched their faces for clues about what to expect, but saw only the same exhaustion and confusion he felt himself. They were lined up in rows for processing. American officers with clipboards moved down the lines, checking names against lists, assigning barracks numbers. A medical officer examined each prisoner briefly, looking for signs of disease or injury. When he reached Klaus, he paused, frowning at the young German's gaunt frame. "This one's malnourished," the doctor said to his assistant. "Make a note. Gradual refeeding protocol. We don't want them getting sick from too much food too fast." Klaus understood enough English to catch the meaning, and the irony almost made him laugh. Too much food. When had that ever been a problem? For the last year, he had been hungry every single day. Wehrmacht rations had dwindled to almost nothing as supply lines collapsed. There had been days when his entire food intake was a piece of black bread and a cup of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. The processing took hours. They were photographed, fingerprinted, issued prisoner numbers. Klaus became prisoner 47293, his identity reduced to 5 digits. They were given clean uniforms, American-made but dyed to distinguish them as prisoners. They were assigned to barracks, given bedding, shown the latrines and washing facilities. Everything was explained through interpreters, German-speaking Americans whose accents marked them as immigrants or children of immigrants. Klaus wondered what they thought, these men of German heritage now guarding German prisoners. Did they feel conflicted? Or had America become so completely their home that the old country meant nothing? By late afternoon, Klaus found himself in Barrack 7 with Hans, Friedrich, Father Wilhelm, and 36 other men. The building was simple but solid, with rows of bunks, a wood stove for heat, and windows that actually had glass. It was better than many places Klaus had slept during the war. Better than muddy foxholes and bombed-out buildings and the concrete bunker where he had spent his last days as a free man. Hans claimed a lower bunk and sat heavily, his face gray with exhaustion. "Well, we are alive. That is something." Friedrich paced the barracks like a caged animal, his young face twisted with anger and confusion. "This is wrong. We should not be here." We should be fighting. The war is not over." An older prisoner, one who had been in the camp for several months, laughed bitterly. "The war is over for you, boy. Accept it. You are one of the lucky ones. You will sit out the rest of the war in safety while your comrades die. You will eat regular meals while Germany starves. You will sleep in a bed while cities burn. If you have any sense, you will be grateful." Friedrich looked like he wanted to argue, but something in the older man's tone stopped him. He threw himself onto a bunk and stared at the ceiling, his jaw working with suppressed emotion. Father Wilhelm moved quietly through the barracks, introducing himself to the other prisoners, offering words of comfort where they seemed welcome. Klaus watched him and felt a pang of something like envy. The pastor still had his faith, still had something to hold on to. Klaus felt adrift, unmoored from everything he had once believed. The Reich had promised glory and victory. It had delivered only death and defeat. What was left to believe in? As evening approached, a guard appeared at the barracks door and called for attention. "All right, listen up. Dinner is at 1800 hours. That's 6 o'clock for those of you who don't know military time. You will form up outside and march to the mess hall in an orderly fashion. The camp commander wants to address you before the meal. Any questions?" No one spoke. The guard nodded and left. The prisoners looked at each other with varying degrees of anxiety and curiosity. Dinner. A meal. Klaus's stomach cramped with hunger at the thought. What would they be given? More of the thin soup and hard bread they had received on the journey? It would be enough. Anything would be enough. At 6 o'clock they formed up outside the barracks. Guards organized them into columns and marched them across the camp toward a large building that could only be the mess hall. Klaus could smell cooking food, and his mouth watered involuntarily. Beside him, Hans inhaled deeply, his eyes closing for a moment. "Meat," Hans whispered. "I smell meat cooking." Klaus sniffed the air and realized Hans was right. The smell was unmistakable, rich and savory, completely unlike the ersatz meals they had survived on for so long. His heart began to beat faster. What did it mean? Why would the Americans feed them meat? They were marched into the mess hall, a large open space with long tables and benches. At one end stood a raised platform where the camp commander waited, a middle-aged American officer with graying hair and a stern but not unkind face. The prisoners were ordered to stand at attention while he prepared to speak. The commander waited until everyone was settled, then began speaking in clear, measured English. A German-speaking sergeant stood beside him, translating sentence by sentence. "Gentlemen, I am Colonel Robert Harrison, commander of this facility. You are prisoners of war of the United States Army, and you will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. That means you will receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. You will be treated with the dignity that all human beings deserve. We do not make war on prisoners. We make war on the Nazi regime that sent you to fight." Klaus listened to the translation, trying to process the words. Dignity. Human beings. These were not concepts he associated with prisoner status. Prisoners were defeated enemies, objects of contempt. Yet the colonel spoke as if they were still men deserving of respect. The commander continued. "You will be expected to work. The Geneva Convention allows for prisoner labor, and we have a labor shortage due to the war. Many of you will work on local farms, helping to bring in harvests. You will be paid a small wage in camp script that you can use at the canteen. You will have access to recreation facilities, to religious services, to educational programs. Your treatment here depends largely on your behavior. Cooperate, and your time here will be as comfortable as circumstances allow. Cause trouble and you will face consequences." Friedrich muttered something under his breath that Klaus could not quite hear, but the tone was clearly defiant. Hans elbowed him sharply in the ribs and the boy fell silent. "Tonight," the colonel said, "you will have your first proper American meal. We want you to understand that America is a land of abundance. We have the resources to feed our soldiers, our civilians, and yes, even our prisoners. What you are about to eat is a typical American meal. Nothing special, nothing fancy. Just ordinary food that ordinary Americans eat every day. I tell you this because I want you to understand what you are fighting against. You were told that America was weak, that we were decadent and soft. Look around you. Look at what we can provide even to our enemies. And then ask yourselves what else you were told that was a lie." The translation finished and silence filled the hall. Klaus felt something shift inside him, a crack in the foundation of everything he had been taught. The colonel was right. If America could feed its prisoners this well, what did that say about the Reich's chances of victory? What did it say about the propaganda that had promised German superiority? The colonel dismissed them, and the guards directed the prisoners to form lines at the serving stations. Klaus shuffled forward with the others, his heart pounding. He could see American soldiers behind the serving counter, wearing aprons and wielding large spoons and ladles. Steam rose from metal containers carrying smells that made Klaus dizzy with hunger. He reached the front of the line and held out his tray, a metal rectangle divided into sections. The first server placed a large bun on his tray, then topped it with a thick patty of grilled meat, a slice of cheese, lettuce, and tomato. A hamburger. Klaus had heard of them but never seen one. It looked impossibly large, impossibly rich. The next server added a generous portion of fried potatoes, golden and crispy. Then came coleslaw, creamy and fresh. A piece of apple pie was placed in one corner of the tray. Finally, another soldier filled a glass with milk, white and cold. Klaus stared at his tray in disbelief. This was more food than he had seen in a single meal in over a year. More food than many German civilians saw in a week. The hamburger alone contained more meat than his entire weekly ration had been for months. His hands began to shake, and he had to concentrate to keep from dropping the tray. He moved to a table where Hans, Friedrich, and Father Wilhelm were already seated. All four of them stared at their trays in silence. Around the hall, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Some were crying openly. Others laughed in a kind of hysterical disbelief. A few, like Friedrich, stared at the food with suspicion, as if it might be poisoned. Hans picked up the hamburger with both hands, studying it from all angles. I have not seen this much meat since before the war, before Poland. This is what they feed prisoners? Friedrich pushed his tray away slightly. It is a trick. They want us to let down our guard. Or perhaps it is drugged. We should not eat it. Father Wilhelm bowed his head, his lips moving in silent prayer. Klaus watched him, feeling a sudden overwhelming need for the comfort of ritual, for the familiar words his mother had spoken before every meal when he was a child, before the war, before the world went mad. Klaus turned to Father Wilhelm, his voice barely above a whisper. Sollten wir zuerst beten? Should we pray first? The pastor's head came up, and Klaus saw tears glistening in the older man's eyes. For a long moment, Father Wilhelm said nothing, just looked at Klaus with an expression of such profound sadness and compassion that Klaus felt his own eyes begin to burn. Yes, my son, Father Wilhelm finally said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, we should pray first. The pastor extended his hands, and Klaus took one, while Hans took the other. Friedrich hesitated, his face conflicted, but finally joined the circle. Father Wilhelm began to speak in German, his voice low but clear. Komm, Herr Jesus, sei unser Gast und segne, was du uns bescheret hast. Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest and bless what you have given us. It was the simplest of graces, the prayer that German children learned at their mother's knees. Klaus had not heard it in years, had not thought of it in longer still, but now the words unlocked something inside him, and he felt tears spill down his cheeks. He was not crying for the food, though God knew he was hungry enough. He was crying for everything that had been lost, for the innocence of childhood meals around a family table, for his mother's gentle voice and his father's stern blessing, for a world that had existed before the madness. At nearby tables, other prisoners noticed the prayer and bowed their own heads. The grace spread through the hall like ripples on water, quiet German voices murmuring the old familiar words. Even some of the American guards paused in their duties, recognizing the solemnity of the moment even if they could not understand the language. One guard, a young man with German features, translated quietly for his fellow soldiers. They are saying grace, thanking God for the food. An older American sergeant nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. They are just kids, most of them. Just kids who got caught up in something bigger than they understood. Father Wilhelm finished the prayer, and the four men sat in silence for a moment. Then Hans picked up his hamburger and took a bite. His eyes closed, and a sound escaped him that was half sob, half laugh. He chewed slowly, reverently, as if the simple act of eating real food was a religious experience. Klaus lifted his own hamburger, feeling the weight of it, the warmth of the meat, the softness of the bun. He brought it to his mouth and bit down. The taste exploded across his tongue, overwhelming in its richness and complexity. The meat was juicy and seasoned with salt and pepper. The cheese was creamy. The vegetables were crisp and fresh. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted, and he had to stop chewing for a moment because he could not swallow past the lump in his throat. Around him, the hall filled with the sounds of men eating, some ravenously, some slowly and carefully, some stopping frequently to wipe their eyes. The American guards watched with expressions ranging from satisfaction to discomfort. It was clear that many of them had not fully understood how desperate the situation had been for German soldiers, how close to starvation these men had come. Friedrich finally picked up his hamburger, his hands trembling. He took a small bite, then another. Then suddenly he was eating with desperate hunger, all his suspicion forgotten in the face of genuine sustenance. Tears ran down his young face, but he did not stop eating. Father Wilhelm ate slowly and methodically, pausing between bites to close his eyes in what might have been prayer or simply overwhelming gratitude. When he finished the hamburger, he looked at the French fries and the coleslaw and the pie as if they were treasures beyond price. Klaus forced himself to eat slowly, knowing that his shrunken stomach could not handle too much rich food too quickly. The medical officer's words came back to him. Gradual refeeding protocol. They were concerned about the prisoners getting sick from eating too much after prolonged malnutrition. It was a problem Klaus had never imagined existed. Too much food. In Germany, the problem was always too little. As he ate, Klaus thought about his mother and sister back home. What were they eating tonight, if they were eating at all? The last letter had mentioned standing in line for hours to get a ration of bread. His sister had written about making soup from potato peels and being grateful for it. And here he sat, a prisoner of war, eating better than he had in years, eating better than his own family. The guilt was almost overwhelming. He was safe while they were in danger. He was fed while they were hungry. He was warm and sheltered while they endured bombing raids and shortages and the daily terror of life in a collapsing Reich. What right did he have to this comfort? What right did he have to survive when so many had died? Father Wilhelm seemed to sense his thoughts. Do not feel guilty for being alive, Klaus. Do not feel guilty for being fed. You did not choose this war. You did not ask to be sent to fight. You are a victim as much as anyone, a young man whose life was stolen by madmen. Accept this mercy, this kindness, and let it teach you something about the world. Klaus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He finished his meal slowly, savoring every bite, trying to memorize the taste and the feeling of fullness, knowing that someday he would need to remember that such things were possible, that the world could contain both horror and kindness, both cruelty and compassion. When the meal was finished, the prisoners were marched back to their barracks. The sun was setting, painting the Kansas sky in shades of orange and purple. Klaus walked in a daze, his stomach full for the first time in longer than he could remember. Around him, other prisoners talked in low voices, processing what had just happened. Back in the barracks, the conversations continued late into the night. Men who had been strangers that morning now shared their stories, their fears, their hopes. The shared experience of the meal had created a bond, a sense of common humanity that transcended rank or background. Hans lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. I fought at Stalingrad, he said to no one in particular. I saw men freeze to death. I saw men eat their leather boots because there was nothing else. I saw the strongest soldiers reduced to skeletons. And tonight, as a prisoner, I ate better than I ever did as a soldier of the Reich. What does that tell you about who we were fighting for? Friedrich said nothing, but his silence was different now, less defiant and more confused. The certainty of his Hitler Youth training was cracking, confronted with a reality that did not match the propaganda. Father Wilhelm sat on his bunk, writing in a small notebook that he had been allowed to keep. Klaus wondered what he was writing. A sermon? A prayer? A record of this strange day? Klaus pulled out the photograph of his family and studied it in the dim light. His mother looked so young in the picture, though it had been taken only 3 years ago. His sister smiled at the camera, gap-toothed and innocent. His father stood behind them, proud in his postal worker's uniform. The photograph had been taken before his father's death in the bombing of Hamburg, before everything fell apart. He tucked the photograph carefully back into his pocket and lay down on his bunk. Through the window, he could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that shone over Germany, over his home, over his mother and sister. Were they looking at the stars tonight? Were they thinking of him? Did they even know he was alive? Sleep came slowly. his mind too full of thoughts and emotions to rest easily. But when he finally drifted off, he dreamed not of war, or death or fear, but of sitting at his mother's table saying grace before a simple meal, safe and loved and home. The days that followed established a routine that was both strange and oddly comforting. The prisoners woke at dawn, performed roll call, ate breakfast in the mess hall. The food continued to be abundant by their standards, though the Americans clearly considered it basic fare. Oatmeal, eggs, toast, coffee. Things that had been luxuries in Germany were daily staples here. After breakfast came work assignments. Klaus was assigned to a farm labor detail along with Hans and a dozen other prisoners. They were loaded onto trucks and driven out into the Kansas countryside, where they worked alongside American farmers to bring in the wheat harvest. The work was hard, but no harder than military service, and infinitely safer. The farmer whose land they worked was named John Miller, a man in his 60s whose own sons were overseas fighting in Europe. He treated the German prisoners with a kind of gruff fairness, showing them what needed to be done and expecting them to do it. He did not fraternize, but neither was he cruel. He was simply a man who needed help bringing in his crop and accepted the labor that was available. During lunch breaks, Miller's wife would bring out sandwiches and lemonade for everyone, prisoners and guards alike. Klaus marveled at the casual abundance of it, the thick slices of ham and cheese, the fresh bread, the sweet cold lemonade. In Germany, such a meal would have been a feast. Here it was just lunch for farm workers. One day, as they sat in the shade of a barn eating their sandwiches, Miller approached Klaus and Hans. He studied them for a moment, then spoke in heavily accented but understandable German. "You boys speak English?" Klaus shook his head, but Hans said, "A little. I learned some before the war." Miller nodded. "Where you from?" "Bavaria," Hans said. "Small town near Munich." "I got family from Bavaria," Miller said. "My grandfather came over in 1880. Settled here, started farming. Good land, good life. He used to tell stories about the old country, but he never wanted to go back. Said America was the future." Hans said nothing, but Klaus could see him thinking. Here was a German who had left, who had chosen America over the fatherland, and who had prospered. What did that say about the Reich's claims of German superiority? Miller continued, "This war, it is a bad business. My boys are over there fighting your boys. Maybe they kill each other, who knows? But you seem like decent fellows. Just doing what you were told, I expect. Same as my boys." He walked away, leaving Klaus and Hans to contemplate his words. The idea that they were fundamentally the same as the American soldiers, just men following orders, was both comforting and disturbing. It suggested that the war was not about good versus evil, but about politics and power, about leaders who sent young men to die for reasons the young men themselves barely understood. In the evenings back at the camp, there were opportunities for recreation. A small library offered books in German and English. There were sports equipment for football and volleyball. Some prisoners organized classes, teaching languages or mathematics or whatever skills they possessed. Father Wilhelm held religious services on Sundays, and Klaus found himself attending, drawn by a need for something to believe in, some framework to make sense of the chaos. The camp also received newspapers, carefully selected by the American authorities, but still offering far more information than the prisoners had received under the Reich. Klaus read about the Allied advance across France, about the liberation of Paris, about the steady push toward Germany itself. The news was devastating for anyone who still hoped for German victory, but Klaus found himself feeling a strange sense of relief. The sooner the war ended, the sooner he might see his family again. Friedrich struggled more than most with the new reality. His Hitler youth training had prepared him for heroic sacrifice, not for comfortable captivity. He picked fights with other prisoners, challenged the guards, refused to work. Finally, after a particularly defiant outburst, he was placed in solitary confinement for 3 days. When he emerged, he was quieter, more subdued. Klaus tried to talk to him, but Friedrich turned away, his face a mask of confusion and shame. The boy's entire worldview had been built on Nazi ideology, and now that foundation was crumbling. Klaus did not know how to help him, did not know how to explain that it was okay to have been wrong, that they had all been deceived. As summer turned to fall, news from Europe grew increasingly grim for Germany. The Allies were pushing toward the Rhine. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Cities were being bombed around the clock. The prisoners received letters from home, when they received them at all, that spoke of desperation and fear. Klaus's mother finally wrote, a letter that had taken 3 months to arrive. She was alive. His sister was alive, but they were living in the basement of a bombed-out building, surviving on rations that barely kept them from starvation. She did not ask about his conditions, did not want to know if he was comfortable while they suffered. She simply said she was glad he was alive and prayed for his safe return. Klaus read the letter over and over, memorizing every word, torturing himself with images of his mother and sister huddled in a basement while bombs fell. And every day he ate 3 meals, slept in a bed, worked in the sunshine. The guilt was a constant weight, but Father Wilhelm kept reminding him that his suffering would not ease theirs, that he should be grateful for his survival and pray for theirs. Winter came, and with it the end of farm work. The prisoners were assigned to other tasks, maintaining the camp, working in the kitchens, doing laundry. The work was easy compared to combat, and the conditions were comfortable compared to the Eastern Front. Klaus knew he was lucky, knew that prisoners in Soviet camps were dying by the thousands, but the knowledge did not ease his guilt or his homesickness. Christmas 1944 arrived, and the camp authorities organized a celebration. There was a Christmas tree in the mess hall, decorated with ornaments made by the prisoners. Father Wilhelm held a special service, and the men sang carols in German, their voices rising in the cold night air. The Americans provided a special meal, turkey and stuffing and all the trimmings, more food than Klaus had ever seen at one time. As he ate, Klaus thought about the Christmas before, spent in a frozen foxhole in France, sharing a can of cold beans with 3 other soldiers. He thought about the Christmas before that, his last at home, when there had still been enough food for a modest celebration, when his father had still been alive, and he thought about his mother and sister, wondering what they were eating tonight, if they were eating at all. The new year brought news of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last desperate offensive. For a few days, some of the prisoners dared to hope that the tide might turn, that the Reich might yet prevail. But the hope was short-lived. The offensive failed, and the Allied advance resumed. By February, it was clear that Germany would fall. The only question was when. Klaus watched Friedrich during this period, worried about the boy's mental state. Friedrich had stopped eating properly, stopped participating in activities, spent his days staring at nothing. Finally, one night, Klaus found him crying in his bunk, great racking sobs that shook his thin frame. Klaus sat beside him, saying nothing, just offering presence. Finally, Friedrich spoke, his voice broken and small. It was all a lie, wasn't it? Everything they told us, everything we believed, it was all a lie. Klaus did not know how to answer. The truth was too painful, but lies would be cruel. Finally, he said, yes, it was a lie. But we were not the only ones deceived. Millions believed. We were just boys, Friedrich. We did not know better. Friedrich shook his head. I volunteered. I wanted to fight. I wanted to kill for the Führer. What does that make me? It makes you a victim, Father Wilhelm said from across the barracks. He had been listening, Klaus realized. It makes you a child who was poisoned with hatred before you were old enough to think for yourself. You are not responsible for what they made you believe. You are only responsible for what you choose to believe now. Friedrich said nothing more, but over the following weeks, Klaus saw a change in him. The defiance was gone, replaced by a kind of quiet determination. Friedrich began attending Father Wilhelm's services. He began reading the books in the library. He began, slowly and painfully, to rebuild himself into something other than what the Hitler Youth had made him. Spring came, and with it the final collapse of the Reich. The prisoners gathered around radios, listening to reports of the Allied advance into Germany itself. They heard about the discovery of the concentration camps, about the horrors that had been hidden from the German people, or that the German people had chosen not to see. Klaus listened to the descriptions of Dachau and Buchenwald and felt sick to his stomach. He had known vaguely that Jews were being persecuted, that they had been sent away somewhere, but he had not known the scale of it, the systematic murder of millions. None of them had known, or so they told themselves. But had they really not known? Or had they simply not wanted to know? The question haunted him. He had been a soldier of the Reich. He had worn the uniform, had followed orders, had fought for a regime that had committed these atrocities. Did that make him complicit? Was he guilty by association? even if he had never personally harmed anyone? Father Wilhelm addressed these questions in his Sunday service, speaking to a barracks full of men wrestling with the same guilt and horror. "We cannot change what was done," the pastor said. "We cannot undo the evil that was committed in our name. But we can choose what we do now. We can choose to face the truth, to acknowledge the horror, to vow that such things will never happen again. We can choose to be better than what we were made to be." On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The prisoners received the news with mixed emotions: relief that the killing had stopped, grief for all that had been lost, fear about what would happen to them now and to their families in occupied Germany. Klaus thought about that first meal, that first hamburger, the moment when he had asked Father Wilhelm if they should pray first. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than a year. That prayer had been about gratitude and fear and confusion. Now, if he were to pray, what would he say? Thank you for survival? Forgiveness for complicity? Hope for the future? He did not know. He only knew that he was alive, that he had been fed and sheltered and treated with a humanity that his own government had not shown to its enemies. He had learned that the propaganda had been lies, that the Americans were not monsters, that the world was more complicated than he had been taught. The months after the surrender were strange and uncertain. The prisoners remained in the camps, waiting for repatriation that was slow in coming. Germany was in ruins, occupied by the Allies, struggling to feed its own people. There was no rush to send prisoners home to add to the burden. Klaus continued to work on the Miller farm through the summer of 1945. The old farmer had grown fond of his German workers, appreciated their diligence and reliability. One day, as they took a break from harvesting, Miller made an unexpected offer. "When you go home," he said to Klaus, "if you find there is nothing for you there, you write to me. I will sponsor you to come back to America. You are a good worker, a decent man. America can always use men like you." Klaus was stunned. The idea of returning to America, of immigrating to the country he had fought against, seemed impossible. Yet the offer touched him deeply. It suggested that he was not defined by his past, that he could choose a different future. "Thank you," Klaus managed to say. "I will remember." Finally, in the fall of 1946, more than a year after the war's end, Klaus received his repatriation orders. He would be returning to Germany, to whatever remained of his home and family. The news brought both joy and dread. He wanted desperately to see his mother and sister, but he feared what he would find. On his last night in the camp, Klaus sat with Hans and Father Wilhelm, the three men who had shared that first meal, that first prayer. They talked about what they had learned, what they would take with them from this experience. "I learned that the enemy is not always who they tell you it is," Hans said. "I learned that ordinary people, on all sides, are mostly just trying to survive and take care of their families. The real enemies are the ones who start wars and send young men to die for their ambitions." Father Wilhelm nodded. "I learned that faith can survive even when everything else is destroyed. That prayer and grace and simple human kindness matter, even in the darkest times, especially in the darkest times." Klaus thought about his own lessons. "I learned that I was lied to about almost everything. I learned that admitting you were wrong is harder than dying for a cause. I learned that a simple meal can change how you see the world." They sat in silence for a while, each lost in his own thoughts. Then Father Wilhelm spoke again. "Do you remember that first night, Klaus, when you asked if we should pray first?" Klaus nodded. "I will never forget it. That question," the pastor said, "contained everything important. Should we be grateful? Should we acknowledge something greater than ourselves? Should we pause before consuming, before taking, before acting? Those are the questions we should always ask, in every situation. Should we pray first? Should we think first? Should we consider the consequences of our actions before we commit to them?" Klaus understood. The question had not really been about the meal. It had been about everything. About the war, about the ideology, about the choices they had made and the choices that had been made for them. Should we pray first? Should we think first? Should we question what we are told before we accept it as truth? The next morning, Klaus boarded a ship bound for Europe. He stood at the rail as America receded into the distance, this strange country that had fed him and sheltered him and treated him with more humanity than his own government had shown. He thought about John Miller's offer, about the possibility of a different life. A different future. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and uncomfortable, the ship crowded with repatriated prisoners all heading home to an uncertain future. When they finally reached Germany, Klaus was shocked by what he saw. The ports were ruins. The cities were rubble. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin and desperate and defeated. He made his way to his hometown, traveling by whatever means he could find, walking when there was no other option. When he finally reached the street where he had grown up, he found that his family's house was gone, destroyed in a bombing raid. His heart sank, but a neighbor told him that his mother and sister had survived, that they were living in a displaced persons camp on the edge of town. He found them there, in a crowded barracks, not unlike the one he had lived in as a prisoner, except that the conditions were far worse. His mother had aged a decade in the 3 years since he had seen her. His sister was thin and hollow-eyed, but they were alive, and when they saw him, they wept with joy. That night, as they shared a meager meal of bread and watery soup, Klaus thought about the Hamburger, about the abundance he had experienced as a prisoner while his family starved as civilians. The injustice of it burned in his chest, but he said nothing. What good would it do to tell them how well he had been fed while they suffered? Instead, he bowed his head and said grace, the same simple prayer that Father Wilhelm had spoken that first night. His mother looked at him in surprise, then smiled through her tears and joined in the familiar words. In the years that followed, Klaus worked to rebuild his life in a shattered Germany. He found work, helped his mother and sister survive the difficult occupation years, watched as the country slowly, painfully began to recover. He never forgot John Miller's offer, kept the farmer's address carefully preserved, but he never wrote. His place was here with his family, helping to build something better from the ruins. But he never forgot that first meal, that moment of prayer, that question that had contained everything important. Should we pray first? Should we pause and think and question before we act? Should we recognize our common humanity before we see enemies? Years later, when his own children asked him about the war, Klaus would tell them about that night, about the Hamburger that had changed his understanding of the world. He would tell them about the American guards who had treated him with dignity, about the farmer who had offered him a future, about the pastor who had reminded him that faith and humanity could survive even the darkest times, and he would tell them about the question he had asked, the question that had become his guiding principle for the rest of his life. Should we pray first? Should we think before we act, question before we believe, recognize our shared humanity before we see differences? It was, he would tell them, the most important question anyone could ask. And the answer, always, should be yes. If this story moved you, reminded you of the humanity we all share even in the darkest times, please consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you untold historical stories that challenge what you thought you knew about the past. Hit that like button if Klaus's journey touched your heart, and drop a comment below telling us, what historical moment do you think deserves to be told from an unexpected perspective? Your suggestions help us uncover more forgotten stories that need to be heard. Remember, history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about real people, real moments, and real questions like, should we pray first? That echo across generations. Subscribe, like, and comment. Let's keep these important conversations alive together.